On the surface, the 1976 Vancouver Conference on Human Settlements, also known as the Habitat Conference, was a success. It was billed as the biggest UN conference to date and attended by such academic luminaries as Barbara Ward, Buckminster Fuller, and Margaret Mead. After 11 days, the delegates produced the Vancouver Declaration. Intended to guide the General Assembly, its more notable suggestions included the adoption of Keynesian land reforms, the establishment of a UN Secretariat for Human Settlements, and potable water for all by 1990. But underlying divisions threatened these successes. A reference to a recent UN resolution equating Zionism with racism split countries along north-south divisions and led former Prime Minister Diefenbaker to declare that, quote, the conference may have sounded the death knell of the UN as an effective body for peace, end quote. Buckminster Fuller notes that the conference produced almost no world-around newspaper reportage. The few articles that were written were cynical. Maclean derided the proceedings as, quote, verbal diarrhea. The conference was considered by many to be a glorified talkfest. Dressed-up delegates mouthed inanities about poverty and homelessness while feasting on oysters and sipping champagne. In a telling example, Pierre Trudeau waxed eloquent about a, quote, conspiracy of love as the only hope for the world to survive until Mother Teresa told him to put his money where his mouth was. The parallel Habitat Forum for NGOs was little better. It was as much a celebration of ethnicity and food as it was an exchange of ideas. It tended to be dominated by the academic stars. At one point, Margaret Mead actually told an 80-year-old Bucky Fuller to shut up after he had blathered on for an hour and showed no signs of stopping. This slidecast will begin with an exposition on the global housing problem. After a brief summary of the Vancouver Declaration, the conference will be examined in the context of geopolitical, economic, and social divisions. Kurt Waldheim, then Secretary General, used a series of statistics to outline the crisis. In 1976, the rate of growth of the urban population was twice that of the general population. In the developing world, a third of the urban population resided in slums. Nearly two-thirds of the population went without safe drinking water, and even fewer had access to hygienic means of waste disposal. In her book The Home of Man, which is written for Habitat, Barbara Ward notes 3 problems with urbanization. First, unplanned urban growth is inefficient and creates physical barriers to later expansion. Second, land speculation drives up rents. Poor people are forced to the outskirts of cities in a sort of economic segregation. Third is the nightmare combination of the 19th century problem of water pollution with the 20th century development of non-biodegradable pollutants. Habitat was part of a wider conceptual shift from a focus on global environmental degradation to its specific causes. It was born out of the 1972 Stockholm Conference, which was the first to broach the issue of international governance of the environment. Reflecting Stockholm's emphasis on the human environment, the Vancouver Declaration positioned human settlements as the basis of development. Improving the quality of human life was to be the paramount goal. The Declaration represents shifts in thinking on the role of the public sector and slums. For the first time, government was given full responsibility for the preparation of spatial strategy plans. The Declaration recognized that the market economy, with its, quote, pressures and inefficiencies, end quote, was unable to properly allocate land. International action was only to supplement those areas which the nation could not address adequately. Provisions were made for a new settlement secretariat to function as a clearinghouse for research and also to coordinate UN efforts. But because delegates could not agree on a location for the headquarters, the ultimate decision was left to the General Assembly. Incredibly, the delegates sanctioned public ownership of land. In part, the decision reflected the wider global trend toward Keynes's interventionist style of government. This served 2 purposes. First, the states could keep prices down to affordable levels. Second, it could plan for urban development. The conversion of prime agricultural land to housing was a key concern voiced at the conference. The Declaration also recommended the, quote, appropriate recapture of surplus value. That is, governments should tax away all the profits earned by speculators. In the 50s and early 60s, slums were seen as unproductive wastelands populated by backward rural peasants. When they weren't plowing them under and relocating their inhabitants, governments generally ignored them. But at Habitat, it was recognized that squatters are often young economic migrants who are driven in the pursuit of work and education. Fuller noted the environmentally friendly way in which they make the most of the few available materials. The Declaration urged that the land tenure of these unplanned settlements be secured, and that their inhabitants be granted easier access to tools and materials. In place of earlier resettlement attempts, urban renewal plans should be gradual. Concerns about population and the need for national policy were driven by poorer countries. Although it voted for the increased public sector role in the real estate markets, the Western world, entrenched in its capitalist institutions, went along grudgingly. It succeeded in watering down much of the language in the Declaration. The Wall Street Journal gives a cynical account of this behavior. Quote, "Such declarations have even less significance than General Assembly resolutions. The U.S. goes along to humor the Third World." End quote. Even in the developing world, public land ownership was unlikely to be implemented. The ruling elites tended to double as landowners and speculators. For all their bravado, they were unlikely to give up their property and power. Differences in economic ideology were overshadowed by the Palestine question. When the Israeli delegation rose to speak, the Soviet, Arab, and African representatives trooped out in protest. The inclusion of a clause referencing a recent UN resolution that equated Zionism with racism nearly scuttled the entire conference. The conference president resigned over the issue, and the Western Bloc voted against the portion of the declaration that contained the reference. At the closing session, an American representative stated that the continuation of this type of tactic does not bode well for my country's support or participation in future United Nations conferences concerned with substantial global problems. Non-state agents were also overlooked in the land reform debate. Buckminster Fuller explains that the great multinational corporations, having long forsaken real estate for the more profitable world of finance, considered the conference's preoccupation with human settlements to be peanuts. As for NGOs, their voices were limited to the Parallel Habitat Forum. The forum was housed in a hastily converted seaplane base at Jericho Beach. Delegates sat on waterlogged benches made from salvaged timber and suffered icy breezes that cut through the inadequate walls. As a final insult, intercommunication equipment was never established between the forum and the conference. Even though they were supported by the forum, Barbara Ward's appeals for universal potable water by 1990 and a moratorium on nuclear energy fell flat. Although Ward noted that clean water would cost a tenth of the world's expenditure on munitions over a decade, the declaration failed to attach a monetary value to the goal. Nuclear energy wasn't even addressed in the declaration. The conference failed because delegates were unable to move past their geopolitical differences. The few substantive resolutions foundered because they were premised on overly controversial issues. But in a wider context, habitat represents the recognition that homelessness in particular, and environmental degradation in general, are global problems which must be dealt with in an international framework. The new UN Secretariat on Human Settlements is an example of international governance in practice. Finally, developed countries are coming into their own. Increasingly, they recognized overpopulation as a root cause of settlement problems and, for the first time, demanded an active strategy to address it. The coalescing of the Global South, albeit around political issues, signifies an attempt to redress the global power imbalance. Just because assemblies don't go according to the developed world agenda doesn't mean they are harmful. Habitat serves as a cautionary tale that petty squabbles and private interests must be set aside if progress is to be made.